feeling on the water when you're paddling a wooden canoe, of course, if anyone who's ever paddled any other sort of canoe and then gets into a wooden canoe knows what it is, because you're one with your environment when you're in that wood, and it's a perfect sort of mating of craft and art and nature.
You have all the benefits of a beautiful wooden canoe and the way they perform and how quiet they are and how beautiful they are, but to be able to say I made it myself is a real thrill.
So a lot of the lakes that I paddle on are lined with white cedar, and that really strikes me as I'm paddling along, that this canoe that's supporting me and putting me through the water is made out of the same thing as these trees that are hanging over the water, and there just feels this sense of belonging.
To be out in a wooden boat in a beautiful natural environment is really a peak experience.
To take off in a wooden canoe on a trip, especially a solo trip, is a very deep meditative moment for me.
There's really something magic about being in a wooden canoe on a sunny day, or lying down on a quiet pond and taking a nap with your feet propped up and watching the clouds blow over.
And sitting in a pod of dolphins and looking over these little low barrier islands to the bay behind them, and looking at a pair of eagles and their two juveniles, and just enjoying the moment.
Where can you go any deeper, any further into canoeing than to use a birch bark canoe, something made from the bark of a tree? How romantic is that?
It truly is a wonderful thing to be on the water, to hear the birds first thing in the morning, to see the sunrise. There's nothing better. There's nothing better, and it really makes me realize that what I do for a living, making wooden boats, is a valuable profession.
When people ask you what you do and you say, "Oh, I build canoes," their eyes always kind of open up just a little bit, and they want to hear a little bit more about it. I don't think it's every day that people meet a canoe builder. 50 years ago, they were canoe manufacturers. There was big business. They had factory workers. Nowadays, it's kind of a one-man show. It's a mom-and-pop kind of outfit, where Emily and I, we're answer the phone, do the material buying, greeting customers, chief bottle washer, and then on top of that, you're doing all the construction from start to finish.
Well, look at it. We've got a lot of canoe builders, and they're doing a lot nicer job than Old Town ever did, or Chestnut. They were building production models. We're building pieces of art now. We aren't building 30 a day like Thompson's did. We're building one that takes 30 days to build it, or more.
I would tell you that a boat builder does, a wooden canoe builder especially, does what he does because he loves to do it. Not one of us that's here as a wooden canoe builder is getting rich building canoes. We do it. It's a good living because it's a good life.
There are some really talented people out there who I don't look at them as competitors. Boat builders tend to be a very individualistic lot, crusty, do it my way, but there's a very strong camaraderie, and the attitude professionally is, I'll do anything I can to help you out. And it's really, really nice.
I think to be a canoe builder is also continuing a really important Americana and North American tradition. So you're really preserving the history of something that at one time was one of the most popular activities in North America.
The first Europeans encountered native people in birch bark canoes. They were astonished to see that these native people could literally paddle circles around their boats. But birch bark canoes were the accepted standard for exploration. If you're going to go into the interior somewhere, you want a boat that you can repair by marching into the forest and getting another piece of spruce root, getting another piece of bark, get some more gum, You want a boat that you can repair easily in nature's hardware store.
Well, there was a European tradition of lapstrake canoes, and this was started in Europe and Great Britain specifically, and then transitioned into the United States, where Rushton picked it up.
Nessmuk, whose real name was George Washington Sears, who wrote Rushton and asked him if he could build as light a canoe as possible. So Rushton thought about this, and he wound up building a boat that was 9 feet long, weighed 10.5 pounds. And this boat is lapstrake construction. And Nessmuk took this boat. He went on a 300-mile tour with it right here in the Adirondacks. He wrote a story about his voyage, which became published in the sporting journal of the day, which was called Forest and Stream. It was the old-time equivalent of Field and Stream or Sports Illustrated. And instantly, overnight in America, the idea of recreational canoeing became the rage.
The commercial demand for canoes far outstripped the ability of people to find enough bark to make canoes. So they needed a good substitute. And people experimented with a lot of different methods of making canoes. They just used canvas.
When the canvas boats came on, they were sometimes derisively referred to as rag boats because they were a lot less expensive to build and therefore less expensive to the consumer.
In the prudish, constipated 1890s, the only way a gentleman could be alone with a young lady would be out in a boat on the river. And so canoeing was extremely popular around Boston College and around Harvard. It was sort of like the 57 Chevy of its day. They were called courting canoes.
The courting canoe is defined by the way the seats are set up and the decking on the canoe. The longer the decks were, the closer you'd have to sit to your girlfriend in the canoe. So the guys wanted to rent the 4-foot-long decked canoes.
In the 1930s, that from Old Town you could buy all wood boats, you could buy wood canvas boats, and you could buy lapstrake boats. And they were all in the same sort of general size and class. It wasn't that long after the aluminum canoes came into their own that people started building small boats, canoes, and kayaks out of fiberglass. And interestingly, fiberglass did to aluminum what aluminum did to the large wooden canoe manufacturers.
I mean, the least fashionable boat in the world in 1955 was a boat made of wood. There were no antique boat shows. There was no wooden boat magazine. There was no wooden canoe heritage. There was nothing.
And I'd go to the dump and you would find perfectly good wooden canoes that happened to be leaking because the canvas was gone regularly. And Roland Jerry's book was essential to saving it in the 70s, early 80s.
The prospects for making a living in wood canvas canoe building were really very dim at that point. Still located in Lubec, which is a very remote part of Maine. You're at the end of the line for supplying anything, and there are no customers for 500 or 1,000 miles.
So we just had our little catalog that we'd pass out at boat shows or the Maine Festival. We went to that a couple times, and so it was very difficult for anybody to find us. And we kind of divided up the ownership of the company. We both thought, well, we'll keep building our own. We'll build canoes or work on restorations as a little bit on the side, and have our real jobs for a while, and we'll see what the future holds.
So I said, well, I'm going to have one last hurrah since I have to get out of this business. And that will be, I'll do a book about it. The book, Building the Maine Guide Canoe, came out in 1980. And about that time, things were just starting to look a little better. The intention of this book that Roland and I did together was to help people actually tackle the building a form, building a canoe, and restoring their canoes. And the reason that it actually worked is because there was really nothing else.
I worked for a log house builder doing finishing carpentry work, and just basically read a lot of books and picked the skills up. And I read Jerry and Roland's famous wood and canvas canoe book, which was, as far as I'm concerned, is the Bible. Also read Ted Moore's Canoe Craft. So I just jumped in and just did some repair work, and then just said, okay, let's do it.
I learned from taking apart the ones I worked on over the years, and I have read a couple of canoe books, Jerry Stelmach's and Roland's, and I've gone to them for references at times on stuff that stumped me. And like canvassing, first canvas job I ever did, I did out of Jerry Stelmach's book, basically word for word, and did a beautiful job.
Well, you start here as like any place, doing some of the basic stuff like making ribs all day long, doing a lot of the chores that add up to the amount of hours that are put into a canoe. So you slowly get eased in the position where you start doing more and more each day. And I think everything that I've learned that Roland has taught me, that I learned by doing it, putting your hands on the boat, bending the ribs, seeing, okay, it's got to move this way or that way, laying the plank down, seeing how the plank wants to lay, trimming it and see, that didn't work, do it again.
So I found a 1909 in Old Town, which I bought for $100, and went about the process for another 2 or 3 years of kind of reinventing the wheel. So I gradually taught myself how to do things, which it was a way of escaping a dissertation too I was writing. So I found it was a lot more fun to pound nails than to pound a typewriter key. So I said, well, let's see what we can do with the canoes, and that's what I've been doing ever since.
And one day I picked up a copy of Wooden Boat magazine, and there was a picture of a wooden canoe in it, and my brain went click, 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 click. And I realized that all these seemingly disparate skills that I had would be a good foundation for a boat builder. And then I started just reading voraciously. And then I started going down East Maine or the coast of Maine, visiting boat shops.
Well, Jerry Stelmach and I met each other here at Wooden Canoe. So he invited me to come up to learn how to loft and build a form. Well, it was kind of the best way to pass down that tradition, because there's nothing better for me than hands-on.
I had done a carpentry apprentice program and wanted to do more woodworking, so I built a strip plank canoe. A little bit later on, I got into building the wood canvas models off of the Kingsbury molds that I got from Mr. Kingsbury. And as far as the lap strake goes, there was books about Rushton's designs and W.P. Stevens' canoe and boat building for amateurs, which had a lot of plans in it. And I just kind of worked it out through the books.
I wanted to learn how to build a canoe, and I came across this person's name, Jerry Stelmach, up in Maine. So I gave him a call and told him what I wanted to do. We spent a couple weeks where I was able to build a canoe in his shop under his tutelage.
The truth is that I didn't know when I graduated college that I had any interest in wood canvas canoes as a full-time profession. After struggling, I would say mightily, through a crash course of having to learn how to do a lot of quick restoration work because we had 10 canoes we had to get completed for the summer, and I made a lot of mistakes, but I ended up really enjoying the hands-on process.
Gidmark had advertised the class as building a birch bark canoe the native way, using no nails, no screws, no glue, no paint. And I thought, what holds it together? How does it stay together? And then the revelations began to come. If you want to know about birch bark canoes, or any bark canoes, Tappanadney's book is the one authoritative source for information, because he spent nearly 50 years of his life researching and documenting bark canoes all over the North American continent. And virtually everybody today who builds bark canoes for a living, they learned by reading the Adney book. Everybody will tell you that. Tom Byers will tell you that. Steve Kayard will tell you that. Ferdy Good will tell you that. Henry Valancourt will tell you that.
Primarily the bark canoes and skin boats of North America by Adney and Chappell. I'm basically self-taught. I did go to visit Henry Valancourt once in I guess 75 or so, and I was certainly impressed by his work. I tend to be attracted to skills that are not widely practiced, and so therefore more of a challenge to learn, and also that I feel I'm doing some good by learning the skill and making it available to other people.
Restoration really appeals to me because you're taking a really old object and giving it a new life again, and in this day of modern products we don't do that very often, but with the old canoes and the nature of a wood canvas canoe, you can get anything apart to put new wood back into it.
You can change the skins on them, you can change the ribs that are broken, you can change out the planking, you can repair the gunnels, restore the gunnels, the stems, every single part of this. If you have an accident, various things can be repaired and restored in the field, which is key. You can continue your trip, get out, bring it to the shop, work on it over winter, or give it to an expert. Either way, that canoe gets to be renewed, recycled, reused, and it can look 100 years later as beautiful as it did the first day it came off the form.
So it's a real thrill to sometimes to restore a boat that's older than you are. I get a kick out of that. I just had a boat in my shop this past winter that was 100 years old, and many times I stopped when I was working on it and could see marks on it or pencil marks on the back sides of things, and I wondered about the people who put those there.
My favorite inspiration comes from the family stories associated with wooden canvas canoes, and either the reason they're buying a new one or why they are willing to invest in an old one that they have.
The grandmother bought it new in 1929. Her son grew up in it. Her grandson grew up in it. It fell into disrepair and the planking's all buckled. The ends are gone. I got the fiberglass off of it, and at that point I had to call him. I called the son and had to have a heart-to-heart discussion with him, because at that point I knew that it was going to cost more to restore this canoe than it was worth. They called back and said, "We want you to proceed." I said, "Okay, as long as you understand that when you get this back, it's going to have a couple of ribs and some of the side planking, and that's about it. I mean, it's essentially going to be a new boat." And he said, "I understand, but it'll still be Granny's canoe."
When they come into the yard and I go out and look at them, as a practical contractor builder, I look at it and go, "Really? Are you kidding me? This is destroyed." And then we all calm down, and there's only so much that can be wrong with a canoe. You know, Rollins said he can build a canoe from one rib. Of course you can. That's the point.
But then as I started to take it apart, it was a chamber of horrors. There were like 28 ribs I had to replace, half the half ribs. Both stems were rotted out so badly. Someone had gone in there with plywood and sort of made up stems, inside stems and outside stems. Didn't bother with it. And, there were thwarts missing and everything. So I said, okay. I dub it Sisyphus. Yeah, every day I go out, it was like rolling that big rock up the mountain, And I'd get up there, and I'd discover something else wrong with it, and back down again.
This is a Old Town Nautica that he'll be working on. Luckily, we happen to have the form this canoe was built on. So this helps a lot when that happens, and it doesn't happen all that often. But there are a lot of frames that need to be replaced in this canoe, And if you can actually build them right, bend them right over the form, you have an advantage.
And it's become about 70% of my business because you got to keep money flowing in the shop. And I've done everything from the 25-foot war canoes to little 12-footers. But the tools and the process for doing wood canvas restoration requires different skills than building a stripper. In a stripper, there's not really any steam bending or anything for bending ribs or even any tacking or nailing because they're edge glued together. In the wood canvas canoes, there's a lot of different skills. Refitting the planking and replacing ribs and inwales and whatnot all requires a whole lot of different skills. So it took a while to learn that.
But when the restorations would come in, you'd see how other people had done it, and you'd start to understand why they did it that way, and you'd see a lot of consistencies between some boats, and say, well, why did everybody do it like this? And you'd try to figure that out, or why did somebody else do it different? And the different styles, and then you start to learn the different kinds of builders there were.
Yeah, well, restoring canoes, we've learned quite a bit from it. You learn that some people build canoes well, and you learn that other people not so well. And I mean, those are great lessons to learn. I mean, you can put those right into your new canoes.
I think it happens with everybody. You get the urge to build something new rather than fixing up things that people have broken or neglected.
I currently am building 4 different new boat models in my shop, and they've come from different places. Some from plans that have been published, others from others where I've had a boat in my shop that I just loved. This would be a boat I was restoring for somebody, and I've taken the lines off of it and done the lofting work and built the form, and then I'm in a position to replicate that boat. In each case, I generally modify the boat slightly to make it unique, to make it my own, if you will. I think that's a pretty typical story for many of the builders today.
Then later on, we built a 16-foot sort of reproduction of the Racine. We made it a little bit wider, but it had essentially the same profile, a little bit steadier maybe, because the original canoes, 100 years ago, they were built for smaller people.
Pretty much I would start with an historic model and then redesign it or change it a bit. So almost all of my designs, I've probably designed 20 to 25 canoes in the 33 years I've been doing this.
The original Grand Lakers started out 100 years ago, a 20-foot double-end canoe that the guides paddled. And eventually, when outboard motors were invented, one of the guides that built canoes got smart and cut the end of his canoe off and mounted a motor on it. And it just evolved from there that all of them turned into square stern, motorized. And the motors are only used to get us to where we're fishing, and then we paddle. We paddle the shorelines, we paddle for salmon, trolling for salmon, and all of my hulls are the same design. I can lengthen them a little. I use different woods to offset one from another, and that's the customer's choice.
I build what are known as cedar strip canoes, wood strip epoxy canoes, and kayaks, sea kayaks, and I also build a cedar strip Adirondack guide boat from the Rushton Designs. The designs I use are my own now, but they sort of intermixed parts of originally E.M. White designs and Old Town Guide designs because I liked those canoes. But then I started fitting boats to individual people. I find it, especially in solo boats, it's very important to fit a person to the size of the boat and for what they're doing. Because if they have too small of a boat, they're in the water all the time. If they have too big of a boat, they're blowing around the lake.
Well, for new canoes, I build, I think I have 11 basic models I build for new canoes, and then each one of those models has a certain variation you can build off of those. And so about half of them, the boats I build, I've designed myself, and the other half are reproductions of historic boats I've liked.
We manufacture canoes from 9 feet through 17.5 feet. This is a range of models, various different styles at each of those lengths. The patterns are for the most part traditional patterns. Some of them are sourced from old Canadian molds or based on old Canadian patterns.
There are certain milestones that come along, and one of them that was looming that I'd been thinking about for a while was the millennium, the year 2000. And what I had in mind was offering a new canoe model based on a very old E.M. White form that I'd gotten, and to incorporate some of the features on it that would, one, tie it to the, since it was a very, very early form, it had its roots deep into the birch bark tradition, which the wood canvas canoe had emerged from, and also incorporate my interests in canoe building, wildlife, and art. The Millennium Sojourners, I call them.
When Dylan and I talk about creating a new canoe, designing a new canoe, which we've done several of, it usually starts with inspiration or somebody's request. It begins with the lofting table, and we have a full sheet of plywood. It's painted white, essentially, and the canoe is drawn out in life size. And so it's half the length of the canoe, depending on the length of the canoe, but you get an opportunity to really draw out and visually see with lines how the canoe is going to look before you've even cut one piece of plywood. And the lofting table is essentially just an amazing puzzle piece.
You have a pretty good idea of what that canoe is going to be like and how it's going to handle on the water if you've done your lofting right and your form building correctly. But you really never know until that canoe comes off the form, it's canvassed, it's filled, it's painted, and you get it on the water.
One of the real challenges that all canoe builders have is finding good quality materials. It's very difficult, for instance, to find long 18 or longer, 18-foot long lumber that is clear, has no knots in it, and has straight grain so that you can make rails or whatever for a canoe. The most important wood for any canoe building project is cedar.
The northern white cedar belt is, northern part of Maine and New Hampshire and Vermont and the Adirondacks, northern Michigan, and in Minnesota, and that's about it, and into Canada. So that's probably why the canoe building has been so prevalent in these areas, other than the fact we also have great canoe country. I would not be able to do this if I didn't live near these sources.
We have a local land trust that's conserved over 1 million acres of land in the area, and it's conserved it for the people of that area to continue logging, continue fishing, guiding, and using the land traditionally as it always has been. And part of that land trust value is I can go into the land trust and get a permit and go cut my own wood wherever I want. In a couple of days, I can have enough wood for 6 or 8 canoes.
Well, finding the materials for birch bark canoe building is all based on a knowledge of the woods. Well, there's 2 main seasons when birch bark is peeled. One is one is in the early spring, and that's the winter bark. And then the summer bark season is, generally speaking, the month of July. I use spruce roots for the lashing and sewing of the canoes, and I primarily use red spruce.
And I like to go right out and look at each individual tree, because I like to look at the trunk of the tree, or what they call the stem, and you look at the bark for the coloration, because that's indicative of how the tree is growing and the health. And then you look at the top of the tree, or what's called the crown. And amongst the hardwoods, what you want to look for is what I describe as a young, athletic adolescent tree, something that's just really going for it and growing well and is rigorous.
I've even gone out in the woods and cut trees and hauled them out on my shoulders and things like that to get them to the sawmill and then saw them up. It's getting harder. The sawmills are disappearing around me, though.
Sawmills that we do business with, they're procuring their logs from sustainably harvested forests. That means that the next generation of canoe builders are going to have, there's going to be cedar out there, there's going to be spruce out there for them to buy.
Form takes longer than it takes to build a canoe, but once you have the form, you can build 1,000 canoes off of that form.
The form is the heart of canoe building. This is the shape of the inside of the canoe. Solidly strip planked, metal bands, stations along the inside.
I have probably 12 different sets of forms for varying sizes, solos and tandems, and then I have another dozen forms for kayaks and guide boats.
And the first thing we did when this came off the form is we put these temporary clamps on. You can see 3 of them here and then 2 on the very ends. And that's just to help hold the shape of the canoe, the width of the canoe together. Because at this point all it wants to do is flatten out into a pancake.
Looks all right.
Does. The fastenings on wood canvas canoes are really very tiny. They're actually about 11/16 or 3/4 of an inch, or 5/8 even, and they're just very sharp canoe tacks. And you can see where every rib is. If you just swing over a little bit to this form, you can see the metal band, and that's what's behind each rib. And that's what clinches the canoe tacks. You'll have the planking down, drive the tack through, it'll go through the rib, hit the metal band, and clinch over. And and there are a lot of tacks in a canoe. A 20-foot canoe with half ribs is close to 3,000 tacks in it, whereas one like this will have a couple thousand probably.
Is the old clinching iron. The clinching iron is used after the canoe comes off the mold. Each tack that you've painstakingly put in and built the canoe needs to be tightened even further.
You know, and you hold that clinching iron just right and you hit that nail just right and you can just feel it bend and it sinks in there just right and you whap, whap, whap and it's done, you know.
Well, this is the room where we do most of our finishing and canvassing. If you swing around, you'll see the different weights and sizes of the raw canvas, which covers the canoe. This is being number 8 and wide for bigger canoes. This being the standard number 10 pre-shrunken canvas that we use on most everything.
You know, in the 70s, there was a big push to take lead out of everything.
Right.
And so they took the lead out of the filler, and they replaced it with silica. And I don't think at the time anybody even thought of the fungicide properties of the lead, because they'd always just used it in boats that never rotten, so it wasn't an issue. And then they started using the silica for a filler. And then all of a sudden people were finding the canvas would rot after a few number of years. And then finally dawned on people that the lead was killing the mold. And so my response is, you know, some people would try to put lead back in, but I didn't want to work with that much lead. Mm-hmm. And so I was able to get this canvas custom treated with the fungicide already in it. So I don't know which is worse, working with the lead or working with a fungicide canvas, but it seems to be not as much exposure to poisons as...
And it's just curing in its cocoon of regular canvas and filler. And we like to let them cure like this for a month.
Because a lot of these boats that get built nowadays are way shinier than they ever would have been when they came out of the factory. That again is the difference between industrial process and craft process. They've got 15 coats. When you bought a boat from Chestnut, you got 2.5 coats of varnish, and that was it, you know.
So I do think there has been a big change in the expectation of the finishes, and I know when I do my repair boats and I've fussed over it and you know, I've done my final coat and a little black fly lands on it and I'm just, you know, devastated because there's a black fly in the finish. And then the person comes and picks it up and they throw it in the back of their pickup truck and merrily bounce out the driveway. So it's like, oh my goodness, why did I take all that time? Because they don't see it anyway. But I think it's an affliction that we have, us boat builders, that try to do the really fine finishes. The lovely woodworking part is over way too soon, and then all you're left with is sanding and coat after coat of varnish or paint. And you know, it has to be done, but I wouldn't say it's the favorite part of the canoe building for sure.
A lot of these Charles River canoes I'll stripe up with gold striping and two-tone paint, and put the name right on the side here in gold lettering and put a design on it. And some people want a logo, like the name a loon or whatever the name of their camp is, or the names on them used to be somewhat whimsical, and they'd put winking owls and the name Oh So Cozy or things like that on them, and I try to incorporate that into it, and whatever the owners want to put on there, I'll do.
This paint design is real famous for Old Town paint design.
Oh.
And when you try to copy that, it's mind-boggling. It takes a day for me to lay it out.
Mm-hmm.
And then it takes you another day to tape it off.
Yep.
And then it takes you like 10 minutes to paint it.
Yeah, of course.
And then you have to take the tape off and retape it and paint the other color, so that's another day. So Old Town had probably a couple hundred different standard designs.
Once the hull's smoothed out, I then glass over the outside of the boat with 6-ounce cloth and 3 coats of epoxy.
I had mentioned that when the fiberglass comes, it comes as a white cloth, and when it's wetted with the epoxy, it turns completely clear, and you can see the beauty of the wood, or you can see the underlying wood come right through.
I do glass a good majority of them. I will canvas them for people that want them canvassed, and I totally believe in canvas canoes. It's the use that a lot of my Grand Lakers get is pretty rough use. They are a working boat, so I like to glass them.
It all begins typically with our table saw and the planer, and just working the wood down.
There's a finer fabrication that's done on those pieces, and that's usually done by hand with certain hand tools.
There are not really
too many tools that are specifically used for building boats. It's anything used for general cabinetry or making fine furniture would work just fine for building boats.
If you do it on the birch bark canoe, they're far fewer yet. People like Steve Cahart and Henry Valancourt, you know, with a crooked knife and a mallet and a bark awl, they can make a beautiful canoe. And because you're working with curved surfaces a lot more than you are straight surfaces in canoe building, spokeshave with its narrow sole is much more useful for a lot of things than it is a plane.
Spoke shaving down a beautiful piece of wood to become your deck is a woodworker's enjoyable moment.
I have a little Lee Nielsen hand plane, a little low-angle block plane, and it gets a lot of use when you're building a canoe. You're always having to plane little bits off here and there.
I really love that particular rabbit plane, the number 92 Stanley, because it allows you to remove material quickly on the planking edge itself. And so when you're fitting the planking and as you are nailing it on to the ribs and you're starting to wet and steam the wood around the curve of the hull, there may be some finite little adjustments you need to make to the removing a little bit more material from the planking.
The other tool that I use a lot is a 2-inch chisel, which is just a chisel. It's maybe about this long with a handle on it, and it's been very carefully sharpened. And you use it mostly for paring. And paring means that you're always just pushing it. You're never striking it with a mallet like you would if you're doing mortise work.
In fact, I remember the first boat I ever built took me a long time to build because every time I got to a step, I had to stop and make the tools or the clamps or the jigs or the whatever that I needed to do that. But, of course, then when you build the second, third, fourth boats, you've already got those and you just take them off the shelf and away you go.
One would be the steam box. I don't think any of those are really commercially available, and even if they were, I probably wouldn't be satisfied with it. So obviously the steam box, that's something that we've made ourselves.
Stretching tools to stretch the canvas. I made them out of water pump pliers and welded pieces on and marked them. The greatest things I've ever seen. You can't get a canvas stretcher from an upholstery places that's strong enough to do it. And of course, the clinching irons, you know, I used everything for clinching irons until we found out that Roland could reproduce the old clinching irons.
I've developed kind of a line of tools that I sell to people. The first thing was this little clinching iron I was talking about, where you bend over the nails. Both Jerry and I were teaching classes at the Wooden Boat School, and so you go to a class with 6 people, and you got 3 canoes, or maybe a restoration class you might have 6 canoes, and you say, okay, now you got to clinch these nails, and you'd have 1 clinching iron, and so you start looking around where can you buy 10 more clinching irons, you know, just nobody made these things, you know, so you got to get them custom made. So I said, well, I can make a little catalog of these things to sell. I said, well, I kind of listed kind of the things that nobody else has, because nobody else is building wooden canoes.
The customers in the early years, a lot of them were young professionals, not quite really young, in their 30s, who were doing well enough to afford to buy a canoe, which they were relatively cheap at that point, but had an interest in the environment and ecology and the outdoors. And there were still working guides and camp-type people who were also interested in more of a commercial use. Customer base was demanding more than just guide-type canoes. My Willow and Willow-Wisp became solo canoes that answered the needs of people who really liked solo paddling and didn't need a 80-pound canoe to do everything that would hold 3 people and 500 pounds of gear.
I would say the main characteristics of my customers tend to be people who really enjoy and appreciate history. They appreciate wood and wooden objects. They don't mind that they need to be cared for. One of my aspects of the people who order a new boat is that they actually are really committing to the life of that boat.
Most of my boats go to other guides in the same business. Probably my best customer, though, are the people that I guide fishing. They spend 3-4 days in one, fall totally in love with it, fishing out of it, and want one to take home and use on their own lakes and ponds.
I've sold canoes to England, Germany, Istanbul, so all over the world really, other parts of the U.S. and into Canada. Lately, a lot of my customers are repeat customers. Either canoes I've restored 20, 30 years ago are coming back, or they'll have a canoe and they want something else.
We've had a knowledge there, or an inherent knowledge there, that people knew what a wooden canoe was. Now I deal with a question that is, well, why is wood better? You know, what's the reason for wood rather than some composite material?
Some people call up and say, I want an Atkinson Traveler, I want it a 1/2 inch deeper, or I want, the front seat 2 inches back from where you normally put it, and that's the last you hear from them until they come pick the boat up. Some customers just take a lot more time, but and some customers don't, so it kind of averages out pretty good, but it's their boat, and that's what you're building. You're building a custom boat for that person.
In terms of how to be successful in the marketplace, it definitely changed with the invention of the World Wide Web. I used to have to do 12 or 15 shows a year to find enough work, and now I don't really do any shows.
I routinely get phone calls or emails from people inquiring about restoration or a new build or whatever, from people that I don't know, that never heard of, but I always ask, how did you find out about me? And invariably it's through the internet.
I remember when it first came out, people say, "Oh, why do you need that?" But it didn't take too long for the handwriting on the wall. Everybody else had websites, and I remember the Wooden Canoe Heritage Association started making websites for canoe builders because they didn't know much about it. Because you work in the shop with your hands, you're not really working on this internet thing.
It would have been at least 10 years ago that I taught myself some web design so that we could build our own website, because it's really important to give the people the impression that we want them to receive as if they were walking in the door and meeting us.
Most of the new boats are see them, feel them, try them kind of a thing. It's not, there's not a lot of people that are just going to buy one off the internet. They have to physically see it and try it and know that that's what they want. A lot of times I'll go to shows and put people on boats and let them try it and let them paddle it, and then they'll come back and talk to me. And it might be 6 months before they really order a boat.
There's something wonderful about putting someone into a wooden canoe for maybe the first time, pushing them out off a dock onto a river or from the shore onto a lake, watching them paddle out, disappear for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, and then finally when they come back, they're all smiles. They're absolutely all smiles. And they'll say, not only is that the most beautiful boat I've been in, ever been in my life, they'll say it was the most beautiful paddle, it was the best experience I've ever had, this is tremendous, thank you very much, I'll buy it. That's my hope. And I think that's what sustains or will sustain the wooden canoe market. The experience is different. The experience is wonderful.
The business part of it's been the hardest thing for me to learn. But if you don't pay attention to it, you don't stay in business. Business requires you to make money, and the craft part of it requires you to put your heart and soul into it.
The most challenge for a business like this is to make a living from it. I think people don't quite understand it. They think it's just sort of this quaint little thing that you do, but I'm working hard.
Because there's no big promise of money, and there's a lot of sacrifice and time, so you have to love the process.
The boats themselves can last generations, but if the skills don't get transferred, when people like Roland and Jerry finally decide I've had enough and retire, there needs to be people that can step up.
Passing this tradition on is the part that worries me. At one time, there was as many as 9 builders in Grand Lake Stream building Grand Lakers, and it was all individuals in their own garage. A year ago, I was the only one building one. Keeping that tradition alive is just as important, keeping that guiding tradition alive, to keep the guides using that canoe, because they're the best salesmen for the canoers.
Most of the people who started this organization had contact with wood canvas canoes when they were going to camp, but now that generation is aging out, and the younger people who might be interested in doing something in the water have no recollection of anything, and they don't even know what these things are. They're amazed to find out they're built out of wood, and they want to know whether they sink even,
A lot of the young guys in their 20s, everyone's all high-teched up now and everything else, so the majority of the reaction is, why would I bother buying one of those when I can get one of these for $600? They're not seeing the tradition, they're not seeing the beauty.
I can see every year it getting tougher and tougher, that next generation. It's harder to get them grandkids to unplug and go fishing for a day.
And I don't know how we get young people into canoes, and if we don't get them into the canoes and loving them, then we won't get them as builders either. So it is a dilemma.
Because I was just talking to my nephew this week about what I do, but he says I might like to learn how to do that and do that kind of. That's a nice. To me, that's a compliment, because that says whatever he's seen, he thinks it's important enough, and it's mattered to him enough that he would want to do that.
The apprenticeship program is sort of tough in wood canvas canoes. Unless you want to keep an apprentice doing cleaning up and sweeping the floor or doing minor tasks, you risk not having the best canoe that can go out of your shop for the client. So it's kind of hard that way. What's worked out better are these courses where people come and build their own canoe. And they have learned a lot. And I've had several of people who have taken courses who have gone into canoe building, and a couple of them successfully. Jeannie Berkwin, who was actually probably the first woman to go into canoe building in modern time.
Like when I teach, I love to see these boats built. I love to get people enthusiastic about them and really get going, wow, this is amazing.
There have been quite a few who have worked with me, starting with when I worked at the Wooden Boat School in Brooklyn, Maine. That was where I met David Moses Bridges, who then he's a Passamaquoddy and went on to build some birch bark canoes on his own, and also to assist me in other classes and workshops. And also I taught a number of workshops in the native communities, both in Maine and New Brunswick. It's been a challenge to be a non-native practitioner of a traditional native craft, being able to help them learn something that's very central to their own traditions, which is, of course, why they asked me to come there.
Being a woman canoe builder has not been an issue at all, and I haven't found it either an issue for any of my customers. I do know when I first started coming, and we'd go to the construction tent, and it would be all guys, and it would be me, and thankfully, I don't see that as much anymore. When you go to the construction tent, I was just there this morning, and there's 2 women carving their own paddles, and there's a couple of men and a woman working on the war canoe that they've got going there, and it wasn't like that in the 80s or the early 90s to the same extent. So that's really encouraging. And yes, but there aren't a lot of us, but I think those of us that are there do really great work, and we make the guys kind of pick up their pace a little bit. And
I also just love that there are women doing what we do, and I think there should be more women doing what we do, because woodworking is not just a man's domain. It's really, an enjoyable way to spend your time, really satisfying, just as any other type of craft-like work that women could be associated with.
In the Wooden Canoe Heritage Association, I'm number 2, so I was pretty much there when we started. Jill and Jeff Dean drove by our house once because it was a shortcut to somewhere. And I had a birch bark canoe sitting in the yard. And so Jeff stopped. And, you know, there's a common interest. We got to be friends. And we decided, especially Jeff, because he had the skills to do it, that it would be neat if there was some kind of organization to pull these interests together. And then we had the first assembly in 1980. And he didn't know if anybody was going to come or not. So we tagged on to the ACA 100th anniversary up at the Clayton Museum. And he just sent out to people saying, we're going to meet at this museum. There's a campgrounds out here. There's a motel here. And we went, and people showed up. And it was just unbelievable.
It's probably the single biggest gathering of wooden canoes and wooden canoe people that ever happens in the world, because for 4 or 5 days you can really immerse yourself in this crazy hobby or passion that we all share. See things, see boats that you would maybe never see anywhere else, buy and sell boats, parts for boats, learn new skills, hear interesting lectures about all sorts of things related to canoeing. If you walk around the green here and talk to people, there are no proprietary secrets, so to speak, that people won't share with you. And as I've developed a modest level of skill in this, I've tried to mirror that same openness.
And I've been glad to participate in it right up to building canoes at the assembly some years. It's a little crazy because you have to pack up everything and take it with you, and some years it's really hot and you're distracted by the crowd and you want to talk to people, but it's fun to see the enthusiasm of people walking in and seeing a canoe actually being built right in front of their eyes.
The WCHA has done an awful lot to help disseminate information about wooden canoes. And one good example of that is the Old Town Build Record project, because it allows them to learn a little bit about the history of their boat, when it was built, who might have been the first owner, even what color it was when it left the factory. And people just like to know more about their boats.
I think WCHA has done a lot to help preserve birch bark canoes, in that they have provided a place where they are welcome, where they're encouraged to be displayed. The rules for WCHA are wood, just wood, no plastic, no metal. Thank you very much. Just wood.
I've made tons of really great friends. We all share a vision of beauty and aesthetic value. And what I found is that when you take a bunch of people and you put them together doing something they love, everybody is happy.
And I think a lot of our new members come from people who have seen canoes at a chapter outing. You know, the chapter's out paddling somewhere and somebody sees it and expresses an interest, and somebody says, well, we're going to paddle next month, and why don't you come and join us? And the next thing you know, we've got somebody who's interested. It's sort of an organic process.
Of course there's a future for the canoes.
I think there's a fair amount of interest in building birch bark canoes. I think it's something that's likely to be carried on in some form.
Form and function really come together in wood canvas canoes. And any art or craft that incorporates that concept and has its roots in the forests and the waterways and of the land, and requires patience and perseverance and care and a love for the craft as well as for the places these canoes can take you, would be a big loss if it were to go. But thanks to efforts and of organizations like the WCHA and some of the museums and Wooden Boat Magazine. It's not going to die and disappear.
So I think it's wonderful to see the level of interest and people that became builders because it struck something in their heart that said, man, I want to do this. This is great. This is a very cool thing.